I had initially intended to write a biography solely of Tecumseh and almost inadvertently fall into the trap of other historians, which is to relegate Tecumseh to second place. And I quickly realized that that couldn't be done and still maintain fidelity to history, because the two of them were co-equal in their influence and creation of this great pan-Indian alliance.
Peter, welcome. Let me know what moved you to write about Tecumseh and his brother.
Well, I had always been fascinated with Tecumseh as the epitome of the great American Indian leader, considered by many to have been the greatest Native American leader. But I found that prior works on Tecumseh tended to neglect his brother, Tecumseh, better known as the Shawnee Prophet, at least to whites. And there was an absence of any attempt to integrate the lives of these two men and to really explore how they influenced one another. The two of them were co-equal in their influence and creation of this great pan-Indian alliance.
Let's deal with the prophet then, since he seems to be dissed by history a little bit.
Right.
What was his message? How did he come to that message?
He was quite an interesting character. And one of the reasons why he's been dissed by history, as you put it, is because he was an unappealing figure, at least to white Americans of the day. He was a disfigured former alcoholic. He shot his right eye out with an arrow. Among his own people, he was known as, a dissipated drunkard and a failed medicine man. And one day in 1805, he was sitting by the fire and he suddenly fell into a trance. He literally just toppled over in front of the fire, and for 2 days, he couldn't be awakened. In fact, his Shawnee friends and relations thought he was dead and were preparing to bury him. And then suddenly he came out of it and began to relate this incredible vision he had had, in which the master of life, as the Indians called God, had taken him to heaven and showed him the error not only of his ways, but also of the Shawnee and other tribes, the error of their ways that had led them into decline and into a loss of their traditional societal values and into decline. And his message, he had many, there are many tenets to it, but the essential creed was that to reclaim their dignity, their way of life, the Indians had to return to traditional ways. They had to eschew almost all that they had received from white Americans, trade goods, alcohol in particular, cease having relations with Americans, and return to a more traditional way of life, and that would allow them to reclaim what had once been theirs. And it was more of a religious and social creed for reinvigorating the Indian people along nativist lines.
What was different about the mission? What was Tecumseh's objectives, his mission, as maybe opposed to his brothers?
It was a symbiotic relationship, no doubt about that. Without Tecumseh, there never would have been a Tecumseh. Tecumseh created the initial alliance around his religious and social and moral appeal. And Tecumseh, who I believe that genuinely considered his brother to be a prophet and to be in touch directly with the master of life, his brother had a greater interest in preserving Indian land from further American encroachment. Tecumseh's approach was to create or to kind of mold the social religious movement that his brother had begun and into a political and military alliance.
What do you think are some of the life experiences that you deem most influential to Tecumseh?
They, as boys, they were compelled to, they were uprooted from their villages 4 times by attacks from Kentucky militia, and brutal, violent attacks that essentially destroyed their hometowns and forced them to move. The Shawnees, as a tribe, began to break up because of this, and more than half of the Shawnees just literally picked up, left modern-day Ohio, and moved west into Mississippi. And so they not only were they forced to move several times because they had been attacked, their villages had been attacked, but they also saw their people crumbling. And they were a small tribe, just over 2,000 people to begin with. And as part of that, and what I find it could not have been anything but traumatic, was that among those Shawnee who decided to migrate west was their mother. And this was when they were both, again, when Tecumseh, I can't recall his exact age then, but I think maybe he was 7 or 8 years old, and Tecumseh was a young adolescent. She literally picked up and moved west to Mississippi with those Shawnees who quit the area, and dumped her sons on her eldest daughter, who was just married and who helped raise them. And I think those 2 factors could not have been other than traumatic for both of them. Despite that, neither developed a visceral hatred for white Americans. Another very traumatic thing for both of them was the influence of alcohol, of liquor, on Indian society. I mean, the Native American villages in the Midwest were awash in liquor, and that was the cause of Tecumseh's personal decline as a young man. But it also was instrumental in the gradual unraveling of their societies.
They are leaders of a pan-Indian alliance at the time. Define that pan-Indian alliance. What was the successes? What were some failures of it?
Tecumseh has sometimes been incorrectly identified as a creator of the first pan-Indian alliance, and that's not the case. I mean, there were ad hoc alliances or smaller alliances of various Indian tribes against first British encroachment and then American encroachment. You had Chief Pontiac in the 1760s opposing the British in the Midwest and the East. He was followed in the 1790s by another Indian alliance under Chiefs Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. Tecumseh himself, later in life, in interviews with the governor of Michigan Territory, this is again later in life after Tecumseh's death, he acknowledged his own debt to Chief Pontiac, who opposed the British attempts to reduce assistance to the Indians and to renege on treaty promises. And the alliance that Pontiac created was based partly on religious and social tenets of a Delaware prophet named Neolin. And so the combined influence of Neolin and Pontiac and the near success they had in expelling the British from what is today the Midwest served as a model for Tecumseh and Tecumseh. There was only a generation removed from Pontiac and Tecumseh and Tecumseh, and the stories of his glories certainly were told to the youthful Tecumseh and Tecumseh. So Pontiac and the Delaware prophet Neolin were clearly direct and important influences on both of them. but those were more limited in scope. What made Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's alliance unique was the vastness of it. Their alliance of disparate tribes stretched from the upper reaches of the Mississippi River all the way down nearly to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. It literally encompassed almost half the United States. So they were able to draw on a much broader number of Indian tribes than had leaders of previous Indian alliances. And to put it in perspective, most people, when they think of an Indian alliance, you kind of default to Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and Little Bighorn, which was certainly the apex of Indian resistance in the West. But Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, at the peak of their alliance, actually had more than twice the number of warriors. It was the scope of it, the size of it, the breadth of it, the number of tribes that they were able to draw into their alliance that made them unique. And also the timing. It coincided with the War of 1812. It was really the last great Indian effort to stop the Western American Republic.
How did they fail? What obstacles led to the failure?
They failed not on account of themselves, but on account of the British allies. Tecumseh realized that he could not oppose the strength of the United States forces in the Old Northwest just with an Indian alliance, that he had to have the material support and the troop support of the British Army if he were going to succeed. And so initially, Tecumseh and the British did quite well. They captured Detroit in 1812. They took the entire Michigan territory, what is today the state of Michigan, and held it. And the British, of course, were limited in how many forces they could send to the United States because they were fighting Napoleon. But if the British had only diverted perhaps another 1 or 2 regiments, maybe 1,500 men, to that theater of the War of 1812, they could very well have prevailed over the Americans.
What obstacles did the brothers face among their own people, Native American?
In the wake of the defeat of the alliance that predated them in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Shawnee and most of the other tribes in their immediate area where they had their villages yielded to the Americans and began to transform themselves and to accommodate themselves to the American way of life, to farming, and reject the more militant approach of Tecumseh. They actually drew most of their support from tribes that had not felt or not been defeated directly by the Americans. So they had a rather fraught relation with their own people. They drew relatively few Shawnee, for instance, into their movement, with partly because the Shawnee knew Tenskwatawa best as a alcoholic, a drunkard, a dissipated nonentity, and they had a difficult time accepting him as a prophet.
We know Tecumseh made a southern trip, campaign, if you will, to rally the southeastern tribes, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee. He failed at that. What was the source of that failure?
Right. Tecumseh traveled in 1811 to visit what have been called the civilized tribes, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek, who essentially controlled almost all of present-day Mississippi, Alabama, western Georgia, southeastern Tennessee. And he ultimately hoped to draw them into his alliance and create a movement of all the tribes east of the Mississippi River not merely those north of the Ohio River, as considerable a number as those were. He failed principally because with the exception of one element of the Creek tribe, the Indians of the South had moved quite far down the road toward accommodation. The tribes of the South were slaveholding tribes. They held black slaves. They had plantations that were often indistinguishable from those of their white neighbors. And they had not really suffered yet from many American attempts to push too deeply into their lands. So with the exception of the Creeks, who were already bifurcating into a more militant element that I guess saw the handwriting on the wall and recognized that they're in danger of losing their way of life and their land to the Americans, and an element of the tribe that had already accommodated to the Americans, the remainder of the southern tribes rejected Tecumseh's appeal. But that element of the Creeks that accepted it, they in turn fomented, in the course of the next 2 years, fomented a civil war among the Creeks that exploded into a war with the United States that ultimately cost the Creeks their dominion over Western Georgia and Alabama, and kind of set things in motion toward the infamous Trail of Tears 2 decades afterwards. So Tecumseh, he did fail in his southern pilgrimage. Not only did he fail in achieving his own ends of broadening even further his alliance, but indirectly doomed the Creek Indians and the other Indian tribes of the South. So it was a pretty tragic failure.
It's, I don't want to say widely known, but the demise of Tecumseh in battle in Canada, I think he did a fantastic job with that. We do not know who killed him. I know Richard Johnson always takes the blame, but less is known about the demise of the Prophet. Explain that a little bit.
Well, I don't want to put a spoiler alert into this, but actually for me that was in some ways perhaps, as I was writing the book, the most moving aspect of the whole story. Because again, as you say, Tecumseh died in battle in 1813, but Tenskwatawa lived on another 2 decades plus. And he had to grapple with the remnants of the Indian alliance that were left after Tecumseh's death and the defeat of the alliance and the British at the Battle of the Thames in Canada. And come to terms with the demise of the alliance and also his declining influence as a prophet. And again, it's really quite moving. And one of the things that helped me relate to him as a human being was that, here is a man who had been a chronic alcoholic. He saw his movement destroyed for the most part. He saw his brother killed in battle, yet Tenskwatawa not only did not himself revert to his dissipated way of life previously, but he also, to an extent, was able to overcome the tragedy, and albeit with a much smaller following, he was able to come to terms with the changing fortunes and the declining fortunes of the Indians in the Midwest, and to an extent adapt to the new way of life. And he, again, not to spoil the story, but he eventually settled in just outside of what is today modern day Kansas City, Kansas. So his life again went on for another 2 decades, and it was very poignant to see his gradual decline of his influence, yet his ability to maintain his personal integrity throughout. So he did not, die gloriously a hero in battle as Tecumseh did. He had to cope with 2 decades of life in which his people had no chance of regaining their near glory during the days of his alliance with Tecumseh.
Fantastic book. I've enjoyed it. Hopefully maybe we can do this again. Maybe we can do it in person.
Yeah, I certainly hope so.